The entire city believed Claire Romano had outrun her husband. Nobody was brave enough to tell them the truth. The truth was that Vito Romano knew exactly where she landed before her plane even touched the runway. He simply never gave the order to bring her back. The most feared man in Verona Heights let his wife walk away with his rival, and the only person who ever knew why was the man standing alone in a dark room, burning wedding photographs at 3 a.m. That man was him. That reason was love. And love, for a man like Vito, was the one thing more dangerous than any enemy he had ever made. Then a woman came along who looked at him like he was nobody, and everything he had buried started moving again. If you have ever loved someone so deeply that punishing them felt more like punishing yourself, this story will reach somewhere real inside you. If you have ever been the most powerful person in a room and still felt completely helpless, stay with me. And if you believe that the most terrifying thing that can happen to a man who fears nothing is meeting a woman who fears him even less, then you already know this story is going to cost you some sleep. Watch until the very last second, because the ending is not what you are expecting. Tell us where you are watching from in the comments. We would love to hear from each and every one of you. Hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. Remember to also turn on notifications to stay updated with our latest stories. Now let's get back to Vito's world. There was a rule in Verona Heights that nobody wrote down because nobody needed to. It was understood the way warnings about deep water are understood, quietly, seriously, and only once. You did not cross Vito Romano. You did not steal from him, lie to him, or position yourself anywhere near the things he considered his. And if by some catastrophic failure of judgment you ever did, you did not run. Because running only added insult to the inevitability of what followed. The city had absorbed enough stories over the years to know that distance was never actually safety where Vito was concerned. It was just a longer walk to the same destination. Verona Heights understood this the way old cities understand everything, quietly, without ceremony, and with the grim acceptance that some things are simply true. Which was why, when Claire Romano boarded a midnight flight and the city woke up to the news that the Don's wife had gone, the only question anyone asked was how she had managed it, not whether he would find her. Weather was never part of the conversation. The theories ran for weeks, and eventually the city settled on the version that required the least amount of rethinking everything they believed about the man. She moved fast. She slipped through. She got lucky. Not one person considered the only other explanation. That Vito had known exactly where she was, and had chosen, in the quiet dark of that long, terrible night, to let her keep going. But that was the truth. He had her location within hours. His men were ready and waiting for a single word, and that word never came. He sat at his desk until the sky changed color and made the only decision of his adult life he could never explain to another soul without it costing him everything the city believed he was. He let her go. He fed the world the story of her flight and carried the real version alone, the way you carry the kind of thing that is only heavy because it came from somewhere genuine. The world got the cold dawn back after that, quieter, more impenetrable. A man who had apparently stared down the humiliation of a fleeing wife and emerged not diminished, but somehow more absolute. Nobody looked closely enough to see that what they were watching was not composure. It was a man who had locked a door inside himself and was no longer sure he had the key. That was the version of Vito Romano that sat at a rooftop restaurant on the west side of the city on an ordinary Tuesday evening, there for a meeting that had already concluded, with every intention of finishing his drink and leaving. Then Jordan Walter opened his mouth. Vito did not know Rebecca Daniels. He had no reason to. She had traveled to this city from somewhere else, carrying the kind of quiet trust in another person that takes real courage to carry, only to be publicly and methodically taken apart by the man she had come all this way to be with. Jordan was doing it with the relaxed ease of someone who had never once experienced a real consequence, saying things loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, wearing his cruelty like a man who had mistaken it for confidence. Rebecca stood through it with her chin up and her eyes full, holding herself together the way proud people hold themselves together when they are breaking, which is to say barely and beautifully, and with a quiet dignity that the moment did not deserve from her. Vito's instinct told him to stay seated. His instinct had always been right, and he had the survival record to prove it. This was not his evening. This was not his problem. He stood up anyway. The rooftop responded the way Verona Heights always responded to Vito Romano in motion. Instantly and completely. Voices dropped. Glasses stopped moving. Jordan Walter turned around mid-sentence and found himself looking at the last page of a chapter he had not known he was in. He read the room with the speed of a man whose survival instinct had just dramatically outpaced his ego, and he left. Quickly, without a word, without his jacket. Vito turned to Rebecca. And she looked at him, this tattooed, broad, unhurried stranger who had just cleared a rooftop simply by standing up, and she said with nothing underneath it but sincerity, "Thank you. Are you okay?" She asked if he was okay, because she had absolutely no idea who he was. She was not from here. She did not know the name or the weight of the silence he had just walked through to reach her. She looked at Vito Romano the way you look at a decent stranger, like he was simply a person who had done a kind thing. He could not remember the last time someone had looked at him like that. He could not remember the last time he had wanted someone to keep looking at him like that. And right there, in the last of the evening light, with the ghost of Claire somewhere in a country that would never know his mercy, and a woman standing in front of him who did not yet know his name, something in the cold dawn quietly, dangerously, began to thaw. Before we talk about Rebecca, we need to talk about Claire. Because you cannot fully understand what Vito became after the rooftop without first understanding what unmade him before it. And what unmade him had a name, a face, and a table for two at a quiet cafe on the east side of Verona Heights. The cafe was called L'Eclisse. In Italian, that word means the eclipse. It means the moment one thing passes in front of another and blocks out the light entirely. Looking back, it was almost too fitting to be a coincidence. Claire Ashton had been 24 years old when she married Vito Romano, and everyone who attended that wedding agreed on one thing. She was stunning in a way that made the room feel slightly smaller, dark-haired and composed, with the kind of quiet elegance that looked like it had always been there rather than learned. What most of those guests did not know, what very few people knew at all, was that beneath the composure was a woman who had spent most of her adult life quietly outrunning a version of herself she had left behind in a small neighborhood on the south side of the city, a neighborhood where she had grown up fast, grown up sharp, and grown up alongside a boy named Rico Martinez. They had been inseparable as children the way only childhood friendships manage, the kind built on shared streets and shared lunches, and the particular loyalty that forms between two people before the world teaches them to be careful with each other. Then life did what life does. Families moved. Directions changed. And Rico Martinez became a memory that Claire folded neatly and stored somewhere she rarely visited, especially after she became Mrs. Romano. She had been married to Vito for 3 years when she walked into L'Eclisse on a Thursday afternoon for nothing more significant than a coffee and a quiet hour to herself. Rico was already there, sitting by the window with a newspaper he was not really reading, looking like the years had been unreasonably generous to him. They recognized each other the way you recognize someone who belonged to a chapter of your life you thought was permanently closed. First the hesitation, then the certainty, then the smile that arrives before you have made any conscious decision to smile. They talked for 3 hours that afternoon. Then they talked again the following week, and the week after that. This is the part of the story where it would be convenient to say Claire was careless or calculating. The truth, as it usually is, was more complicated than either. What she found in those Thursday afternoons at L'Eclisse was something she had not known she was missing until it was sitting across the table from her. Someone who knew her before the ring, before the name, before the life she had built inside the fortress of Vito's world. With Rico, she was not the Don's wife. She was just Claire. And for a woman who had spent 3 years learning to be careful about everything she said and everywhere she stood, that feeling was devastating in the worst possible way. The affair lasted 7 months. 7 months of stolen afternoons and silenced phones and a guilt she managed to compartmentalize with a discipline that should have impressed her if she had allowed herself to think about it clearly. She did not think about it clearly. People rarely do when they are standing in the middle of something that feels like relief. What ended it was not conscience. It was a phone call at 6 in the morning from a number she did not recognize, a voice she did not know, and 4 words that made her hands go cold. He already knows, Claire. She was packed and moving within the hour, not because she believed she could outrun him. She knew better than that. She ran because standing still felt like a decision she was not ready to make. The folder landed on Vito's desk at 9:47 on a Wednesday evening. He knew the exact time because he had looked at his watch the moment his most trusted lieutenant, a man named Caruso who had been with him for 11 years and had never once brought him news he enjoyed, set it down with the particular careful silence of someone placing something near a flame. Caruso left without being asked. He closed the door behind him and told the 2 men outside the hallway to take the rest of the night off. He did this because he had worked beside Vito long enough to understand that what was inside that folder was going to require privacy, and that privacy, in this specific instance, was an act of mercy for everyone within earshot. Vito opened it. He did not rush through it. He read every page with the same measured attention he gave to everything: the photographs, the phone records, the locations, the dates, the timeline laid out in neat chronological order by the man he paid to be thorough. 7 months, 31 meetings, all of them at Eleclis, which he had driven past 100 times without a single thought. Rico Martinez. Of all the names in all the world that could have appeared on those pages, the universe had selected that one, and Vito sat with that particular detail for a long time. The rage came up the way it always came up in him, not loudly, not with heat, but as a cold and clarifying pressure that settled behind his eyes and made everything very still. He was not a man who broke things when he was angry. He was a man who became extraordinarily quiet, and that quiet, as everyone who had ever sat across from it understood, was the more dangerous of the 2 options. He picked up his phone, he held it, he set it back down. His men were ready. They had been ready since Caruso walked out of that room. One word from him and the machinery of consequence would begin moving, efficient and irreversible and absolute. The city expected exactly that. In the hierarchy of unforgivable things, a wife choosing a rival's company was not just a personal wound. It was a statement. It was a challenge. It was the kind of thing that, left unanswered, invited interpretation. And in Vito's world, interpretation was the beginning of vulnerability. He knew all of this. He had understood the mathematics of power since he was 19 years old. None of that knowledge stopped him from doing what he did next. He walked to the fireplace, took the wedding photograph from the mantel, the large framed one from the reception where Claire was laughing at something just off camera, genuinely laughing, the way she rarely did in posed photographs, and he held it for a moment longer than he intended to. Then he put it in the fire. He went back to his desk, retrieved the rest of them from the drawer where they had lived since the day she framed them, and he fed them to the flames one by one until there was nothing left but the smell of smoke and the particular silence of a room that has just witnessed something it cannot explain. He did not call his men. He did not give the order. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, sat back down, and in the long dark hours before morning arrived, he arrived at a truth that cost him considerably more than anger ever had. The life he had built, the name, the power, the fortress of loyalty and fear that surrounded everything he was, it had never been a home to Claire. It had been a sentence. And the man who had loved her, the real version of him that existed underneath all of it, could not bring himself to be the one who carried it out. So he made the hardest decision a man like him could make. He let her believe her own escape. He gave her the gift of thinking she had outrun him, wrapped it in silence, and carried the weight of what it actually was entirely alone. The city got a colder dawn after that. They just never knew why. Years had passed since the night Vito fed those photographs to the fire. Years of cold mornings, colder decisions, and a city that had quietly accepted the version of him that emerged from that room as the only version that existed. The wound had not healed exactly. It had simply been built over, the way cities build over old foundations, and most days Vito did not think about what was underneath. Most days the dawn was enough. Most days the work, the structure, The discipline of a life run on loyalty and consequence filled whatever space was left. Then came the rooftop. Then came Rebecca. Her name was Rebecca Daniels. She was 29 years old, and she was leaving in 8 days. She told him this over coffee at a small place 2 streets from the rooftop restaurant, because after Jordan left without his jacket and the crowd quietly returned to their own evenings, Vito had asked if she was all right, and she had said mostly. He had said that mostly was not entirely convincing. She laughed for the first time all evening at his cringe, subtle jokes. It was the kind of laugh that arrives unexpectedly, the kind that surprises the person it belongs to, and it did something to the atmosphere between 2 strangers that neither of them fully acknowledged, but both of them felt. She was visiting from Callaway, a smaller city 4 hours north, where she worked as a curator for a mid-sized art gallery that she spoke about with the quiet enthusiasm of someone describing something they genuinely loved, rather than simply did. She had come down to see Jordan, whom she had been with for 14 months, and who had apparently spent those 14 months carefully concealing the version of himself he had displayed so generously this evening. She said this last part without bitterness, which Vito found more impressive than if she had said it with anger. Anger was easy. Composure after humiliation required something else entirely. 8 days, she said, then she was going home. Vito sat across from her in a coffee shop where nobody knew him, which was not a situation he found himself in often within the borders of this city, and he turned those 8 days over in his mind the way you turn over something you are trying to find a use for. 8 days was not long. 8 days was also, he thought, long enough for one thing that he had not permitted himself in longer than he cared to calculate. The chance to simply be a man, not the Don, not the name. Not the weight of everything Verona Heights had spent years loading onto his shoulders. Just a man, sitting across from a woman who looked at him like he was exactly that, and nothing more complicated. He told her his name was Enzo. It was not entirely a lie. His mother had called him that until he was 12 years old, before the world got hold of him and turned a boy named Enzo into something considerably harder to approach. It was the most honest dishonesty he had ever practiced, and he held it carefully. He asked if she had seen much of the city beyond Jordan's apartment. She said no. He said that was unfortunate, and she deserved better than that from a city this size. She said she was starting to think she deserved better than quite a few things. He said he thought she was probably right, and she looked at him sideways with the beginning of a smile, and that was more or less how it started. He took her to dinner the following evening at a restaurant where the food was extraordinary, and the lighting was honest. The evening after that they walked through the old quarter of the city where the architecture was 100 years old, and Rebecca stopped every few minutes to look at things properly, the way people who understand beauty actually look at it, with patience rather than haste. Vito walked beside her and said very little and felt something in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. It was not happiness exactly. It was closer to the memory of happiness, recently disturbed, beginning to move. During the days, he was someone else entirely. On the morning of their 3rd evening together, Vito sat at the head of a table in a room with no windows and addressed 4 men who had made the significant error of redirecting funds that did not belong to them. The conversation was short and very clear, and by the end of it all 4 men fully understood the precise nature of the position they were in, and what the next 48 hours required of them if they wanted those hours to be followed by more. Caruso stood by the door and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The cold dawn had spoken, and the room had received it accordingly. That same evening, Vito sat across from Rebecca at a small table in her rented apartment where she had cooked something simple and unpretentious and genuinely good. And she talked about a painting she had seen in a gallery window that afternoon, and why the composition was quietly extraordinary. And he listened with his full attention, and felt the distance between his 2 days stretch inside him like a fault line running beneath ground that looked entirely stable from the surface. He was Enzo here, warm, present, unhurried. He was Vito Romano everywhere else, and everywhere else was not going anywhere. 8 days, he reminded himself. He would manage 8 days. What he had not yet accounted for was what he would do on the 9th. While Vito Romano was counting down 8 days in Verona Heights and pretending even to himself, that he was not already dreading the ninth. A man 4 hours and an entire world away was counting something else entirely. Rico Martinez had been counting nights, 3 years worth of them, and not one of those nights had been quiet. He and Claire had built a life across the border in a coastal city called Marin, the kind of place where the streets were narrow and unhurried, and nobody asked questions about where you came from or what you had left behind. Claire had adapted to it with a resilience that Rico genuinely admired. She had found work, made friends, learned the local rhythms, and constructed something that looked very much like peace. Rico had constructed something that looked very much like peace also. The difference was that Claire's version was real, and Rico's was a performance he gave every single morning for an audience of one. Because Rico Martinez understood something about Vito Romano that the coastal streets of Marin did not. He understood that silence from a man like Vito was never the same thing as forgiveness. It was not even the same thing as indifference. Silence from Vito was a climate. It was the specific atmospheric condition that existed in the period between when a decision was made and when it was carried out. Rico had grown up on the edges of this world long enough to know the difference between a man who had genuinely let something go and a man who was simply waiting for the geometry of the moment to align in his favor. 3 years of waiting for a knock on a door that never came, and somehow that was worse than if it had. It was a phone call from an old contact in Verona Heights that found him on a Thursday morning while Claire was out. The contact was not a close friend, more of a peripheral figure from Rico's previous life, the kind of man who collected information the way others collected debts, casually and with an eye toward eventual usefulness. What he told Rico was brief. Vito Romano had a woman, a visitor from out of town, someone the city had not seen before and could not yet place. The Don had been seen with her twice in 4 days, relaxed and unhurried, which in Verona Heights was the kind of detail that people with good memories and good instincts noticed and filed away carefully. Rico stood in his kitchen for a long time after the call ended. The rational part of his mind, the part that Claire's steadiness had been quietly nourishing for 3 years, suggested that this was nothing significant. That men moved forward. That Vito having a woman was not inherently a message addressed to Rico Martinez specifically. That not everything in the world was architecture designed to draw him out of hiding. The other part of his mind, the part that had been awake at 3 in the morning for 1,000 consecutive nights, said something entirely different. It said that Vito Romano did not do anything without intention. It said that a man who had every reason to act 3 years ago and had not acted was not a man who had made peace with the situation. It said that a very deliberate, very patient, very dangerous person going suddenly and visibly soft in public was not a coincidence. It was a stage, and stages in Rico's experience were always built for a specific audience. He was the audience, the woman was the bait. He told himself he was being irrational. He made coffee, sat down, and talked himself through it twice with the measured logic of a man determined not to unravel. By evening, he had almost convinced himself. By the following morning, when a second contact confirmed the story completely unprompted, the almost disappeared entirely. Rico Martinez began making his own arrangements. Quietly, carefully, and with the particular urgency of a man who had just concluded that waiting was no longer a luxury he could afford. Across the border in Verona Heights, Vito Romano was walking Rebecca through an art gallery and genuinely laughing at something she said. He had no idea that somewhere in the coastal city of Marin, the past was already packing its bags. By the 6th day, Vito had stopped counting. That was how he knew he was in trouble. The 8 days had been a container, a clean and manageable boundary he had constructed around something he told himself was temporary. And somewhere between the old quarter walk and the dinner in Rebecca's apartment, and the afternoon she stood in front of a gallery window on Merchant Street and described a painting to him in a way that made him see it completely differently. The container had quietly stopped doing its job. Rebecca Daniels was not a complicated woman in the way that made people difficult. She was complex in the way that made people worth knowing, full of considered opinions and genuine curiosity, and a particular brand of honesty that did not announce itself but was simply always present in the room. She said what she meant. She laughed without calculation. She pushed back on things she disagreed with, including things he said, which was an experience so novel for Vito that the first time it happened he had sat with it for a full minute before responding, mildly stunned and considerably more interested than he had been 30 seconds prior. She had no idea what she was doing to him. That was perhaps the most disarming part of all. On the 7th evening, they sat on the small balcony of her rented apartment with the city laid out below them, and Rebecca said that she had not expected to enjoy this city as much as she had. She said it quietly, almost to herself, and Vito understood without her elaborating that she was not talking about the architecture or the restaurants. He looked at her for a moment and said that the city had not expected to deserve it. She turned to look at him, and something passed between them in the silence that followed that neither of them reached for, but both of them held onto carefully. He almost told her his name that night, the real one. He constructed the sentence twice in his mind and dismantled it both times, because telling Rebecca his name meant telling her everything attached to it, and everything attached to it was the one thing guaranteed to turn the way she looked at him into something he could not recover from. So he said nothing, and hated himself quietly for it. The 8th morning arrived with the particular cruelty of things that have been anticipated for so long they almost feel like a relief when they finally come, except they never actually are. Rebecca had a bag packed and a car booked, and a life in Callaway that had been waiting patiently for her return. She was practical about leaving the way she was practical about most things, without drama, without performance, just a woman doing the necessary thing with composure. Vito stood in the doorway of her apartment and felt the particular weight of a decision forming in him that he recognized immediately and was not proud of. He had the means to make her stay, not through persuasion. Through the other methods available to a man of his specific resources and disposition. The thought arrived fully formed and specific, and he understood in the same breath that entertaining it for even a moment made him exactly the kind of man he had been trying not to be for the past 8 days. He let her go. He said goodbye with the measured warmth of a man who was storing everything he was actually feeling somewhere it would not show, and he watched her car until it turned the corner, and then he stood on the empty street in the morning light and did something he could not remember doing in a very long time. He made a phone call that had nothing to do with consequence or leverage or the machinery of his world. He called the owner of the gallery on Merchant Street, the one with the painting Rebecca had described to him with such unguarded reverence on their second evening, the one she had returned to twice more during her stay without ever going inside because the price on the listing in the window was the kind of number that ended conversations. He bought it, not the painting, the entire gallery. He put it in a name that could not be traced back to him and arranged for Rebecca to receive a formal offer of partnership within the week, structured as an anonymous investment in her professional expertise. It was the most expensive and elaborate way a man had ever refused to simply say how he felt. Even Caruso, who heard about it the following morning and had seen Vito do extraordinary things, looked up from his coffee with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering everything he thought he understood about his employer. 2 days later, Rebecca called Enzo from Callaway. She said something very strange had happened. She said an investor she could not identify had just offered her a partnership in a gallery in Verona Heights, the exact gallery she had mentioned to him in passing, and that the terms were so precise and so generous that it felt less like a business arrangement and more like someone had been paying very close attention. She asked, in the careful tone of a woman who already suspected the answer, if he knew anything about it. Vito told her he did not, and for the first time since they met, she did not entirely believe him. Rebecca's suspicions sat on the phone line between them like a third person in the conversation. Vito had said he knew nothing about the gallery, and she had not entirely believed him, and they had both let that small, careful silence exist without pushing it further. The call had ended warmly enough, with a promise to talk again soon, and the particular unresolved tension of two people who were not yet saying everything they meant. Vito had set the phone down and stood at his window for a long time, looking out at the city and understanding with absolute clarity that the lie he had built around himself was developing cracks he could no longer paper over with charm and careful conversation. What he did not know, what he could not have known standing at that window, was that someone else had arrived in his city while he was busy navigating the delicate architecture of his feelings for a woman 4 hours north. Rico Martinez had driven in quietly. No announcement, no advance team, no footprint that Vito's network might catch before he was ready. He had left Claire and Marin with a reason he manufactured carefully enough that she accepted it without alarm, and he had crossed the border with 1 bag, 2 phones, and the focused, frightened energy of a man who had finally talked himself into something he could not talk himself back out of. He checked into a small hotel on the eastern edge of the city under a name that was not his own. It was a modest place, deliberately chosen, the kind of establishment that asked no questions because its clientele had historically preferred it that way. He paid in cash, took the stairs instead of the elevator, and sat on the edge of the bed in room 7 with his hands clasped together and his mind running through the calculation he had been running for 3 years. Vito Romano had let them go. That fact, which should have been a source of relief, had become the source of everything that kept Rico awake, because it made no sense. It violated every known principle of how a man like Vito operated, and things that violated known principles did not do so without reason. Rico had arrived at only one conclusion that held its shape no matter how many times he examined it. Vito was waiting. And if Vito was waiting, then at some point the waiting would end, and Rico had decided, sitting in that kitchen in Marin on the morning of the second phone call, that he would rather choose the moment himself than have it chosen for him. But he was not reckless. Whatever fear was driving him, Rico Martinez had not survived 3 years on the wrong side of Vito Romano's patience by being reckless. He needed information before he moved. He needed to understand the landscape, the woman, the routine, the gaps. He needed to know if his instinct about the setup was correct before he committed to anything irreversible. So he started with Rebecca. It was not difficult to find her. The gallery partnership offer had generated a quiet paper trail that a man who knew where to look could follow without much effort, and Rico knew where to look. Within 48 hours of arriving in the city, he had her name, her location in Callaway, her scheduled return to Verona Heights to finalize the gallery arrangement, and her pattern of communication with the man she knew as Enzo. He watched her from a distance the afternoon she arrived back in the city, standing across the street from the gallery on Merchant Street, with the patient stillness of a man who had learned that observation was the most underrated weapon available to anyone who had the discipline to use it properly. She was not what he expected. She moved through the city with an ease that suggested she had no idea she was being watched, which told him one important thing immediately. Vito had not warned her, which meant either she was genuinely just a woman he cared about, or the trap was more sophisticated than Rico had given him credit for. Both possibilities were equally dangerous. Rebecca had come back to the city. Vito had told himself that the gallery arrangement was purely logistical, that her return to Verona Heights to meet with the investment team was a business matter that had nothing to do with him personally, and that he was not going to make it into something it was not. He had maintained that position with impressive conviction right up until the moment she called to say she had landed, and he heard her voice, and every sensible argument he had constructed dissolved quietly and without resistance. He asked if she would come to an event with him, a gala, annual, high-end, the kind of evening where the city's most significant people gathered in expensive rooms to remind each other of their significance. He framed it casually, the way people frame things they care deeply about when they are not ready to admit how deeply they care. She said yes with the ease of someone who had already decided before the question was finished, and he spent considerably longer than he would ever admit selecting what he wore that evening. She looked extraordinary. He told her so directly, which was not something the cold Don was historically known for, and she looked at him sideways in that specific way she had developed over their 8 days together. That meant she was pleased, but was not going to make it easy for him. They arrived together, and the room responded the way rooms in Verona Heights always responded to Vito Romano. That immediate, collective recalibration of posture and conversation that happened whenever he entered a space. Rebecca noticed it. She leaned slightly toward him and said quietly that people seemed to really know him here, and he said that he had lived in the city a long time, and she accepted that the way she had been accepting the edges of his answers for weeks, with the patience of a woman who was building a larger picture from the pieces she was being given and was not yet finished. The evening moved well. Vito was present in a way he was not always present at these events, less interested in the room and more interested in the woman beside him, and Rebecca moved through it with a natural composure that drew attention without seeking it. For approximately 2 hours, it was the closest thing to an ordinary evening Vito had experienced in longer than he could honestly measure. Then Jordan Walter walked in. He had apparently received an invitation through a professional connection and had apparently not considered, or had chosen to disregard, the very reasonable possibility that this decision might not serve him well. He saw Rebecca first, and something flickered across his face that was equal parts guilt and the particular arrogance of a man who had revised the rooftop incident in his own memory until he had become the reasonable party. He crossed the room toward her with the practiced confidence of someone who had prepared what he was going to say. He had not prepared for Vito to turn around. What happened next was not loud. That was the part that stayed with everyone in the immediate vicinity long after the evening ended. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no visible threat of any kind. Vito simply looked at Jordan Walter with an expression that belonged to an entirely different man than the one Rebecca had been standing beside all evening. The warmth left his face the way warmth leaves a room when a window opens in winter, completely and immediately. What replaced it was something that the people of Verona Heights recognized with the instinctive accuracy of long experience, and that Jordan Walter understood one terrible second after he should have. The dawn was in the room. Jordan stopped walking. Then he took a step backward, then another. Then he turned and located the nearest exit with the focused efficiency of a man who had just significantly revised his understanding of his own evening. The people nearby found reasons to be elsewhere. Conversations resumed at a careful distance. The radius around Vito expanded without anyone appearing to consciously expand it. Rebecca watched all of this. Then she turned to Vito and studied his face for a long moment, the way she looked at paintings in galleries, with patience and full attention, reading what was actually there rather than what she expected to find. Then she said, very quietly, "Who are you, Enzo?" Not with fear, with the steady, serious eyes of a woman who had just decided she was done accepting edges. Vito did not answer her question. Not because he did not want to, and not because he had not been building toward an answer for weeks without fully admitting it to himself. He did not answer because in the precise moment Rebecca asked who he was, the lights in the east corridor of the building went out. It was a single second of darkness, quickly restored by the venue's backup system, and to most of the room it registered as nothing more than a minor electrical interruption that briefly interrupted their conversations. To Vito it registered as something else entirely. His eyes moved to Caruso across the room before the lights had fully returned, and Caruso was already moving, which told him that Caruso had registered it the same way. Then the first window broke. What followed happened in a sequence so fast and so violently at odds with the elegance of the evening that the room simply could not process it at the speed it arrived. 3 men came in through the side entrance with the coordinated efficiency of people who had studied the layout, timed the shift change of the venue's security, and arrived with a specific objective rather than general chaos. They were Rico's. Vito knew it before he could have explained how he knew it, the same way you know certain things that your body understands before your mind catches up. He moved Rebecca behind him in one motion, smooth and absolute and non-negotiable, and she went without resistance because something in the way he moved had answered her question more completely than any words had managed. The Enzo she had been having dinner with for the past several weeks stepped back. What stepped forward in his place was someone she had not met before. The first of Rico's men raised his weapon, and Vito was already not where he had been standing. He covered the distance between them with a speed and a purposefulness that had no trace of the unhurried warmth Rebecca had grown used to. And he dealt with the situation with a terrifying economy of movement. No hesitation, no excess, just the absolute and practiced efficiency of a man returning to a language his body had never forgotten. The second man came from the left and met the same outcome before the first had fully registered what had happened. The third, the one who had positioned himself furthest back with the specific intention of being the last problem, found that the calculation had not accounted for how quickly the first two problems had been resolved. The room had emptied around them with a speed that suggested the people of Verona Heights had spent considerable time mentally rehearsing exactly this kind of exit. Then it was quiet. Vito stood in the wreckage of the evening with his breathing steady and his expression completely controlled and his hands, the same hands that had wiped a tear from Rebecca's face on a rooftop weeks ago and held her fingers across a dinner table and gestured gently at architecture in the old quarter of the city, telling a story that required no translation. He turned to face her. Rebecca had not run. She was standing exactly where he had placed her back against the wall and her eyes on him, taking in everything the room had just shown her with the same complete and unhurried attention she gave to paintings she was trying to fully understand. There were tears on her face, though he could not have said with certainty when they had arrived or precisely what had put them there. He looked at her and said nothing, because there was nothing left to construct or manage or carefully word. Everything he had spent weeks concealing was standing in the room between them as plainly as the broken glass and the overturned chairs and the three men on the floor. He waited for her to run. It was the only outcome his history had prepared him for. Claire had run. Everyone ran eventually. It was, he had concluded long ago, the only rational response to knowing what he truly was. Rebecca did not move. And that is where we leave Vito Romano. No longer a man hiding behind a borrowed name, but a king who finally found something worth being known for. If this story reached something real inside you, do not keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, because stories like this were never meant to be watched alone. And if you are not already part of this family, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what comes next. Because trust me, what comes next is worth staying for. Drop a comment below and tell me one thing. Were you Team Vito from the beginning, or did Rebecca's courage at the end surprise you? And if this story moved you even a little, a like takes 2 seconds and means more than you know. Until the next story, take care of yourself. And remember, the most dangerous people are not always the ones the world fears. Sometimes they are the ones quietly choosing love over revenge in a dark room at 3 in the morning. See you next time.